The combat simulation chamber fell silent as Cadet Amanda Kowalski limped toward the center of the arena, her right leg dragging slightly with each step. Around her, cadets from 12 different species watched with expressions ranging from polite concern to barely concealed disdain. The Zephyrian instructor, Veltar, observed from his elevated platform, his crystalline eyes reflecting the harsh training lights. Cadet Kowalski, his voice resonated through the chamber's acoustic enhancers, each syllable precise and cutting. Your performance metrics indicate a 17% decrease in mobility efficiency. Perhaps you should consider transferring to the logistics division where physical limitations are more accommodating. A ripple of chittering laughter came from the Skahari delegation, their serpentine forms coiled in what passed for amusement among their kind. The massive Corvin cadets remained stoic, but their tusked faces showed clear disapproval. Even her human classmates shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Amanda stopped in the center of the arena, her weight shifting to her left leg as she faced the instructor. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, revealing a face marked by faint scars along her jawline, scars that none of her classmates had ever asked about, though they'd all noticed them during their first week at the Galactic Defense Academy. "With respect, sir," she replied, her voice carrying across the chamber without amplification. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about what constitutes a limitation." Veltar's crystalline features shifted, light refracting through his translucent skin in patterns that indicated mild irritation. "Explain." The arena's environmental systems hummed softly as Amanda reached down and began rolling up the leg of her training uniform. The fabric gathered just above her knee, revealing what the medical scanners had detected but never fully explained: a prosthetic limb seamlessly integrated with her remaining biological tissue. The synthetic muscles and servo joints gleamed under the training lights, but it was the scarred flesh where metal met bone that drew sharp intakes of breath from several alien cadets. "This isn't a weakness," she said, straightening up. "It's an upgrade." A Velcorian cadet, her blue-scaled face twisted in confusion, spoke up. "What happened to your limb, human?" Amanda's expression grew distant for a moment, her eyes focusing on something beyond the chamber walls. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to add years to her 19-year-old frame. A hunt that refused to end. The Skari stopped their chittering. Even the massive Corvins leaned forward slightly, their warrior instincts recognizing something in the human's tone that transcended species barriers. Veltar descended from his platform, his movements fluid despite his rigid demeanor. "Elaborate, Cadet. Your file mentions a colonial settlement incident, but the details are classified above my clearance level." Amanda nodded slowly, her fingers unconsciously tracing the junction where flesh met metal. "Kepler 442b, my family's settlement. We called it Haven Creek. Ironic, considering what it became." The chamber's lighting system automatically adjusted to optimize acoustics as her voice dropped to just above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in. "We'd been there 3 years when the Ravagers found us. Pack hunters, about the size of earth wolves, but with the intelligence of dolphins and the cruelty of, well, nothing in Earth's evolutionary history prepared us for what they could do." She began pacing slowly around the center of the arena, her limp more pronounced now but somehow purposeful, like a predator marking territory. They didn't just hunt for food. They hunted for sport, for the psychological terror. They'd take settlers one by one, leaving evidence of their kills where the rest of us would find them. My younger brother Jake was first. They left his communicator playing a recording of his final moments on our front porch. The Velcorian cadet's scales had shifted to a deeper blue, a sign of distress in her species. Several other cadets were showing similar physiological responses, their various forms of emotional regulation failing them as the human story unfolded. The colonial authority wanted to evacuate us, but the transport ships were 3 weeks out. The Ravagers had learned to jam our long-range communications, so we couldn't even call for military support. 37 families, including children, trapped on a world that had become our personal hell. Amanda stopped pacing and faced the group directly. The pack was led by an alpha we started calling the Ghost. Pure white fur, twice the size of the others, with scars covering half its face. It had been hunting humans specifically for over a decade, island hopping between settlements. Local authorities had reports of similar attacks on 5 other colonies. Veltar's crystalline form had dimmed slightly, a sign of deep concentration in his species. How many were in the pack? 43 confirmed, possibly more. Amanda's voice remained steady, clinical. They operated in coordinated cells of 6 to 8, with the alpha directing overall strategy. They'd hit supply routes, communications arrays, power generators, always at night, always when we were most vulnerable. She gestured to her prosthetic leg. This happened during week 2 of the siege. The Ghost had taken Mrs. Rodriguez, the settlement's doctor. We could hear her screaming from the forest, but it was obvious bait. They wanted us to come after her. A young Corvan cadet, his tusks barely developed, rumbled a question in his native language. The translation matrix rendered it as, "Your warriors fell for their trap?" Amanda's laugh held no humor. We didn't have warriors. We had farmers, engineers, teachers, people who'd never held a weapon beyond basic training 15 years prior. But we had something the Ravagers didn't expect. She knelt down and began detaching the prosthetic leg with practiced efficiency, the servo joints hissing softly as they disengaged. Several cadets instinctively stepped back as she removed the limb entirely, revealing the scarred but healed flesh beneath. They expected us to behave like prey, to panic, to make emotional decisions, to break under pressure. She held up the prosthetic, its advanced construction gleaming in the training lights. Instead, we became something they'd never encountered before. Standing on one leg with perfect balance, she continued her story. While the pack was focused on their psychological warfare, my father and 3 other engineers were in the machine shop, converting mining equipment into weapons. Mom and the other teachers had turned the school into a fortress, with overlapping fields of fire and emergency protocols that would make a military tactician proud. The Eskahari delegation had gone completely silent, their serpentine forms coiled tightly in concentration. This was clearly not the story they'd expected from what they'd assumed was a crippled human child. But the Ghost was smarter than we gave it credit for. It had been watching us, learning our patterns. When we finally went after Mrs. Rodriguez, it wasn't the ambush we expected. It was a full-scale assault on the settlement while our best fighters were away. Amanda reattached her prosthetic with swift, efficient movements, each connection sealing with a soft hiss. The attack came at 0300 local time. Ravagers hit the school, the power station, and the communications array simultaneously, but they made one critical error. She stood and tested the leg's connection, her movements becoming smoother as the systems integrated. They assumed human children would be helpless. The arena fell completely silent, except for the ambient hum of environmental systems. Even Veltar had stopped moving, his crystalline form perfectly still as he waited for her to continue. My sister Emma was 14. She'd been helping Dad in the machine shop for 2 years, and she'd paid attention during every self-defense class our security chief had ever conducted. When 3 Ravagers broke into the school's main shelter, they expected to find terrified children huddled in the dark. Amanda's eyes had gone hard, the same expression that had unnerved her instructors during combat simulations. Instead, they found 30 kids with improvised weapons and absolutely nothing left to lose. Emma coordinated the defense while I tried to get the little ones to the emergency bunker. She rolled her shoulders, working out tension that seemed to have accumulated during the telling. The Ghost came for me personally. It had somehow figured out that taking out the older kids would break the adults' will to fight. Smart strategy, but it was operating on incomplete information. The prosthetic leg began to emit a soft humming sound as she engaged its full range of motion systems. It cornered me in the corridor leading to the bunker. Massive thing, muscles like steel cables under that white fur. Its breath smelled like rotting meat and fear sweat from dozens of previous kills. Several alien cadets were now displaying obvious signs of distress: chromatic shifts, involuntary chittering, the release of stress pheromones that the chamber's air recycling system was working overtime to process. It didn't kill me immediately. That was its mistake. The ghost wanted to savor the moment, to break me psychologically before finishing the job. It clamped its jaws around my leg just below the knee and began to shake like a terrier with a rat. The Corvin cadet who had spoken earlier was now leaning forward intently, his warrior instincts fully engaged. "You survived by playing dead?" Amanda shook her head. "I survived by playing human." She reached into her utility belt and withdrew what appeared to be a standard multi-tool, but as she activated it, the device unfolded into something far more sophisticated. Part medical instrument, part weapon, part engineering device. While the ghost was focused on savaging my leg, I was focused on staying conscious long enough to use the one advantage humans have that no other species truly understands. She held up the multi-tool, its various components gleaming. "We don't give up. Ever. Even when logic, instinct, and every survival mechanism in our brains is screaming at us to quit." The device in her hand began to emit a high-pitched whine as she activated its cutting laser. The ghost had crushed the bone, severed arteries, and was working on tearing the leg completely off. Any rational being would have gone into shock and died. Instead, I cauterized my own femoral artery with a plasma torch while using my other hand to drive a mining spike through the creature's skull. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Even the environmental systems seemed to have gone quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The ghost died still attached to my leg. I had to use the plasma torch to cut through its jaw muscles to get free. She deactivated the multi-tool and returned it to her belt. By the time the rescue teams arrived, the siege was over. The pack had scattered after losing their alpha, and the settlement had survived with minimal casualties. Veltar's crystalline form had brightened considerably, light refracting through his body in patterns that indicated deep respect among his people. And the prosthetic? Military grade, installed at the trauma center on New Geneva. But I insisted on modifications. She tapped the leg with her knuckles, producing a metallic ring. Enhanced servo motors, integrated power supply, emergency medical systems, and a few other features that aren't in the standard configuration. A Zephyrian cadet near the back of the group spoke up, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones typical of her species. "Why didn't you accept a biological regeneration treatment?" "Your species has the technology." Amanda's smile was sharp and predatory. "Because the ghost took my leg, but I took its life. This," she gestured to the prosthetic, "reminds me every day that humans don't stay prey for long." She moved to the center of the arena and assumed a combat stance, her weight distributed evenly between her biological and artificial limbs. "Now, sir, about that 17% decrease in mobility efficiency, would you like to run that simulation again?" Veltar looked around the chamber at the assembled cadets, noting their expressions of newfound respect, wariness, and in some cases, outright fear of the young human. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been approval. "I think, Cadet Kowalski, that our mobility assessments may need to be recalibrated for human baselines." The Corvin cadet who had questioned her earlier stepped forward, his massive frame somehow deferential despite his size advantage. "What happened to the rest of the pack?" Amanda's expression went cold. "The hunt that refused to end?" "It became a hunt that couldn't end, not until every last one of them was dead." She began moving through a series of combat forms, her prosthetic leg functioning flawlessly as she demonstrated kicks, pivots, and defensive maneuvers that would have been impossible with standard colonial authority prosthetics. The mining company hired a specialist tracking team, but they gave up after 3 months. The colonial military deployed a full battalion, but bureaucracy and budget constraints pulled them out after 6 months, with only 12 confirmed kills. Her movements became more aggressive, each strike and block executed with mechanical precision. So I volunteered for the job. The revelation sent another wave of shocked silence through the chamber. The idea of a human teenager hunting down a pack of apex predators was difficult for most species to process, given their understanding of human physical limitations. The military laughed at first. A 17-year-old girl with one leg volunteering to track creatures that had defeated their best special forces units. But my family had contacts in the colonial government, and the settlements were demanding action. They gave me a provisional hunter's license and figured I'd either succeed or become one more casualty they could blame on the Ravagers. She completed her forms and stood facing the group, not even breathing heavily, despite the intense physical demonstration. They provided me with basic equipment and a transponder so they could recover my body when the time came. Everything else, I improvised. The Skahari delegation had begun to emit low-frequency sounds that their translation software couldn't properly render, but the emotional content was clear, a mixture of admiration and instinctive fear of a superior predator. It took me 18 months to track down and eliminate the remaining 31 members of the pack. Some died in traps, others in direct combat. A few tried to flee off-world, but colonial security was more cooperative once I'd proven that the threat could be eliminated. Veltar had descended to the arena floor and was circling Amanda slowly, his crystalline form reflecting the chamber's lights in complex patterns. 18 months of solo hunting. How did you survive? By learning to think like they did. Ravagers are pack hunters, but they're also individuals with distinct behavioral patterns. The ghost had been their strategic mind, but without it, they reverted to more primitive hunting behaviors, predictable patterns I could exploit. She reached into another utility pocket and withdrew what appeared to be a simple data pad, but as she activated it, holographic displays materialized, showing detailed terrain maps, behavioral analysis charts, and what looked like a complex tracking algorithm. I mapped their movement patterns, identified their preferred prey species, and cataloged their individual quirks and weaknesses. Most importantly, I figured out something about Ravager psychology that the military specialists had missed. The holographic display shifted to show a 3-dimensional model of pack behavior, with individual creatures represented as moving dots across a complex environmental matrix. They're not just pack hunters, they're pack thinkers. Their individual intelligence is actually fairly limited, but when they operate as a group, their collective decision-making becomes sophisticated enough to qualify as true tactical genius. Remove the alpha, and you don't just eliminate their leader, you drop their collective IQ by about 50%. A Velkorian cadet, her scales now shifting to patterns indicating intense curiosity, moved closer to examine the holographic display. This is military-grade analysis software. How did a colonial teenager acquire such advanced systems? Amanda's smile was genuinely amused for the first time since the conversation began. I didn't acquire it. I built it. Turns out that spending 3 years helping Dad maintain mining equipment teaches you a lot about programming, systems integration, and creative problem-solving. She manipulated the holographic controls, and the display zoomed in on a specific geographical area marked with dozens of red indicators. The first kill was pure luck. I'd tracked a lone Ravager to a box canyon, thinking I could trap it and eliminate it with minimal risk. What I didn't realize was that it was already injured and separated from its packmates. The display showed a detailed topographical map of the canyon, with movement tracks and timing indicators overlaid in different colors. The creature was desperate and sloppy, making noise and leaving obvious sign. When I finally cornered it, I expected a fight. Instead, it rolled over and exposed its throat in a submission display. Several alien cadets exchanged looks of confusion. Submission behavior among predator species was universal, but the implications of Amanda's story were disturbing. It had recognized me as its alpha's killer. In Ravager social hierarchy, that made me the new pack leader by right of combat. It was trying to join my pack. The silence that followed was profound and unsettling. The idea that a human teenager could inspire submission from apex predators challenged fundamental assumptions about interspecies behavioral patterns. "I killed it anyway," she said quietly. But I learned something important that day. The remaining pack members weren't just hunting randomly. They were looking for a new alpha, and they were testing every potential leader they encountered, including me. Veltar had stopped circling and was now standing directly in front of her, his crystalline features reflecting her image in fractured, multiplied patterns. "You accepted the challenge. I turned it into an advantage. Instead of hunting them one by one, I established myself as the apex predator in their territory. I left sign that they would recognize, scent markers, territorial displays, the kinds of behavioral cues that would trigger their instinctive responses." The holographic display shifted again, showing a complex pattern of movement tracks converging on a central location. Within 6 months, they were coming to me, not as prey seeking a predator, but as pack members seeking to challenge their new alpha or join my hunting group. A young Corvin, his tusks barely visible beneath his lip, spoke up with obvious admiration. "You made them hunt themselves. I made them behave according to their nature, while I behaved according to mine. The difference was that human nature includes the ability to plan 17 steps ahead, while simultaneously adapting to unexpected circumstances." She deactivated the holographic display and returned the datapad to her utility belt. Ravagers are brilliant tacticians, but they're poor strategists. They can solve immediate problems with incredible creativity, but they can't think beyond their current situation. The prosthetic leg whirred softly as she shifted her weight, the sound almost musical in the arena's enhanced acoustics. The last one took me 3 months to track down. It had learned to avoid the behavioral patterns that had betrayed its packmates, and it had started displaying genuinely innovative survival techniques, smart enough to steal supplies from abandoned settlements, creative enough to use human technology to mask its scent, and careful enough to avoid leaving any trackable sign. She paused, her expression growing distant again. When I finally found it, it was living in the ruins of Haven Creek, in my family's house, specifically. It had been there for weeks, possibly months, sleeping in my old bedroom and eating from our abandoned food stores. The revelation sent another wave of shocked silence through the chamber. The psychological implications of a Ravager choosing to inhabit the home of its alpha's killer were disturbing on multiple levels. It wasn't trying to hide from me. It was waiting for me. When I walked through the front door, it was sitting at our kitchen table, still as a statue, watching the doorway. No aggression, no fear, no submission, just patience. Veltar's crystalline form had dimmed to its lowest setting, a sign of deep contemplation among his species. "What did you do?" I sat down across from it, and we looked at each other for about 10 minutes. It was the strangest experience of my life, staring into the eyes of something that had killed my brother, terrorized my family, and cost me my leg, while feeling a kind of mutual recognition that I still don't fully understand. She reached up and touched the scars along her jawline, the first time she'd acknowledged them during the entire conversation. "These are from that encounter, not from claws or teeth, but from flying glass when it finally moved. It launched itself across the table faster than anything that size should be able to move, and I barely got my arms up in time to protect my throat." The chamber's medical scanners had been monitoring her vital signs throughout the story, and several alien cadets were displaying stress responses to the elevated adrenaline and other biochemical markers her body was producing as she relived the memory. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds of real time, but it felt like hours. We went through the kitchen wall, across the living room, out the front window, and into the yard where I'd played with Jake before the siege began. Her voice had dropped to just above a whisper again. When it was over, we were both covered in blood, mine and its, and I was holding its throat in my hands while it looked up at me with what I swear was gratitude. A Skahari near the front of the group made a sound that the translation matrix couldn't process, but the emotional resonance was clearly one of horrified fascination. It died peacefully, no struggle, no final attempt to take me with it, just a long, slow exhalation and then stillness. She straightened up and looked around the chamber at the assembled cadets. That night, I built a funeral pyre for all 43 of them, burned their bodies and scattered the ashes in the forest where they'd lived and hunted. Veltar moved closer, his form brightening slightly with what might have been approval, an honorable gesture toward worthy adversaries. More than that, a recognition that the hunt had changed both sides. They'd made me into something I hadn't been before, and I'd given them a death that honored their nature as hunters. She gestured toward her prosthetic leg. This reminds me of that transformation every day, not as a disability, but as an evolution. The arena fell quiet again as the implications of her story settled over the assembled cadets. The human they'd dismissed as physically inferior had just described a level of sustained, methodical violence that most military specialists would consider impressive in a seasoned combat veteran. A Velkorian cadet who hadn't spoken before raised her hand tentatively. "Cadet Kowalski, what did you do after the hunt ended?" Amanda's expression lightened slightly, returning to something closer to her actual age. "I applied to the Galactic Defense Academy. Figured that if I could track down and eliminate apex predators in their natural habitat, I might have some useful skills to contribute to interspecies defense initiatives." She turned to face Veltar directly. "Which brings us back to your original assessment, sir. You suggested that my mobility limitations might make me better suited for logistics rather than combat operations." The crystalline instructor's form brightened considerably, light refracting through his body in patterns that indicated something approaching humor. "I believe I may have been operating on incomplete information. With respect, sir, most people do. They see the limp, the prosthetic, the scars, and they assume weakness. They don't ask about the hunt that refused to end, or what it takes to become the apex predator in someone else's ecosystem." She moved to the center of the arena and assumed a ready stance, her artificial leg humming softly as its systems engaged. "I'm not asking for special treatment or accommodations. I'm asking for the opportunity to demonstrate what human persistence looks like when it's properly motivated." The chamber's training systems activated automatically, responding to her combat stance by preparing the arena for a full-intensity simulation. Energy barriers rose around the perimeter, and holographic targets began materializing throughout the space. The Ravagers taught me that the difference between predator and prey isn't size, speed, or natural weapons. It's the willingness to keep fighting when every rational thought in your head is telling you to quit. The first wave of holographic enemies began their attack pattern, and Amanda moved to meet them with a fluid grace that made her prosthetic leg seem not like a disability, but like a precision instrument designed specifically for combat. They also taught me that the most dangerous opponent isn't the biggest or strongest or fastest. She dispatched 3 targets in rapid succession, her movements economical and devastatingly effective. It's the one who turns their limitations into advantages. As she fought through the simulation, the assembled alien cadets began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a human with advanced prosthetics, This was a human who had been forged into something new by circumstances that would have broken most beings. The simulation intensified, adding more targets and environmental hazards, but Amanda's performance only improved. Her prosthetic leg provided her with capabilities that biological limbs couldn't match: servo-enhanced jumping ability, gyroscopic stability, and integrated systems that allowed her to process environmental data in real time. "The hunt that refused to end," she called out between exchanges with holographic enemies, "taught me that humans don't fight to win. We fight until there's nothing left to fight against." The final wave of the simulation included enemies specifically designed to exploit mobility limitations, fast, low-flying targets that would normally require perfect balance and footwork to engage effectively. Instead of struggling with these challenges, Amanda seemed to dance around them, her prosthetic leg allowing her to maintain stability while executing moves that would be impossible for most biological entities. When the simulation ended, she was standing in the center of the arena, surrounded by the dissipating remains of dozens of defeated targets, not even breathing heavily, despite the intense physical demands of the exercise. The silence that followed was different from the previous quiet moments, not shocked or disturbed, but filled with a kind of reverent awe that transcended species barriers. Veltar was the first to speak, his crystalline form bright enough to cast rainbow patterns on the chamber walls. "Cadet Kowalski, I believe we need to discuss an immediate transfer." For a moment, Amanda's confident expression wavered, and she looked like the teenager she actually was. "Sir, to the Advanced Combat Leadership Program. Your current training level is insufficient for your demonstrated capabilities." The alien cadets began to stir, their various species expressions of approval creating a chorus of sounds that the translation matrix struggled to process. The Corvan delegation was rumbling in what was clearly admiration, while the Eskahari had begun the harmonic humming that indicated respect for a superior predator. Amanda relaxed slightly, her stance becoming less predatory and more human. "Thank you, sir. Though I should mention that the prosthetic isn't the only modification I've made since the hunt ended." She reached up and touched the scars along her jawline, and for the first time, the assembled cadets noticed that the marks weren't random. They formed a precise pattern that matched the spacing of Ravager claws. "These aren't from the final fight. I put them there myself, using a Ravager claw I kept as a trophy. In their culture, scars like these mark an individual as a successful alpha, someone who has proven their dominance through combat." The revelation sent another wave of shocked silence through the chamber, but this time it was mixed with something approaching fear. The idea that a human would deliberately scar herself with the markings of apex predators suggested a level of psychological adaptation that most species would consider disturbing. "I wear them as a reminder that the hunt never really ends. There's always another challenge, another pack of predators, another ecosystem that needs a new apex species." She looked around the chamber at the assembled cadets, her expression serious, but not unkind. "The difference is that now I hunt for protection instead of revenge." Veltar moved closer, his crystalline features reflecting her scarred face in multiplied patterns. "And what do you hunt now, Cadet?" Amanda's smile was sharp and predatory, but somehow reassuring. "Whatever threatens the pack I've chosen to protect." She gestured to encompass the entire chamber and everyone in it. The Galactic Defense Academy isn't just a training institution. It's a pack formed from dozens of species, each contributing their unique strengths to a collective defense system. And like any pack, it needs members who are willing to hunt down threats that others can't or won't engage. The prosthetic leg whirred softly as she shifted her weight, the sound somehow musical in the enhanced acoustics. "The Ravagers taught me that survival isn't about individual strength. It's about understanding your role in the ecosystem and fulfilling that role with absolute commitment." A young Zephyrian cadet stepped forward, her harmonic voice carrying undertones of curiosity. What role do you believe humans fulfill in the galactic ecosystem? Amanda was quiet for a moment, considering the question with obvious seriousness. We're the species that doesn't know when to quit. Every other intelligent race in the galaxy has evolved sophisticated mechanisms for recognizing futile situations and disengaging from them. Self-preservation through rational assessment of odds. She began moving through another series of combat forms, her prosthetic integrating seamlessly with her biological movements. Humans evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day for millions of years. We developed persistence as a survival mechanism, but we never developed the ability to recognize truly hopeless situations. The forms became more complex, incorporating acrobatic elements that showcased her enhanced capabilities. That makes us valuable in scenarios where other species would rationally conclude that success is impossible. We keep fighting when the odds are 1,000,000 to 1 because we genuinely don't understand that we're supposed to lose. She completed the sequence and faced the assembled cadets directly. The hunt that refused to end taught me that this isn't a bug in human psychology. It's a feature. Sometimes the galaxy needs someone who's too stubborn to accept defeat. The chamber fell quiet again, but this time the silence was contemplative rather than shocked. The alien cadets were beginning to understand that they weren't just looking at a human with impressive combat skills. They were looking at a representative of a species whose fundamental nature might be uniquely suited to certain types of challenges. Veltar's crystalline form had reached maximum brightness, casting complex patterns of refracted light throughout the chamber. Thank you for sharing your story, Cadet Kowalski. I believe it has been educational for all of us. He looked around the chamber at the assembled cadets, noting their expressions of newfound understanding and respect. Class dismissed. Cadet Kowalski, please remain behind for a moment. As the other cadets filed out of the chamber, several paused to offer gestures of respect or acknowledgement, a Corvan battle salute, a Skahari harmony of approval, a Velkorian chromatic display of admiration. The humans in the group looked at her with mixtures of pride and awe that suggested they were seeing their own species in a new light. When the chamber was empty except for Amanda and Veltar, the instructor approached her with something that might have been paternal concern in his body language. That was quite a performance, he said quietly, both the story and the demonstration. But I have to ask, how much of it was intended to achieve a specific result with our audience? Amanda's expression shifted to something more genuinely thoughtful, her predatory confidence giving way to the analytical mind that had tracked and eliminated 43 apex predators. All of it was true, sir. But yes, I chose to share it in a way that would maximize its impact on their understanding of human capabilities. She gestured toward the door where the other cadets had exited. Most species approach interspecies relations from a position of assumed superiority or inferiority based on physical and technological metrics. They see humans as primitive because we're newer to galactic civilization, or weak because we lack natural armor or enhanced sensory capabilities. Veltar's form dimmed slightly, indicating deep concentration. And you wanted to challenge those assumptions. I wanted to provide context for human behavioral patterns that might otherwise be misinterpreted. When humans refuse to surrender in hopeless situations or continue fighting after taking casualties that would break other species, it's not because we're stupid or fanatical. Her expression grew serious. It's because we've evolved to survive scenarios where surrender equals death, and sometimes the only way through a problem is straight through it. The instructor was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of her statement. You're saying that what other species might consider irrational human behavior is actually a sophisticated survival strategy adapted to specific environmental pressures. Exactly. The hunt that refused to end was just one example of that strategy in action. Give a human an enemy that needs to be eliminated, provide minimal resources and support, then get out of the way and let human persistence do what it does best. She moved toward the chamber exit, her prosthetic leg functioning with perfect efficiency. The Galactic Defense Academy needs to understand that human cadets aren't trying to prove themselves despite their limitations. They're trying to demonstrate their capabilities because of their adaptations. Veltar followed her to the exit, his crystalline form reflecting the chamber's lights in patterns that suggested both approval and concern. I'll make sure your insights are included in the next revision of our interspecies psychology curriculum. At the doorway, Amanda paused and looked back at him. There's one more thing you should know, sir. The hunt that refused to end? It's not just a story about something that happened in the past. Her expression had returned to the predatory alertness that had unnerved her classmates. I'm still hunting. The prey has changed, but the commitment remains the same. Whatever threatens the safety of this academy, this program, or the beings I've chosen to protect, it becomes my target until it's eliminated. She touched the scars on her jawline one final time. That's what these marks really represent. Not past victories, but a promise of future ones. With that, she left the chamber, her slight limp marking a rhythm that sounded less like a disability and more like a war drum beating out the cadence of humanity's refusal to yield. Veltar remained in the empty chamber for several minutes, his crystalline form cycling through light patterns as he processed what he'd witnessed. Finally, he activated his communication system and composed a priority message to the Academy's command structure. Subject: immediate reassessment of human cadet psychological profiles. Priority: maximum. Content: we may have significantly underestimated the strategic value of human persistence behaviors. Recommend immediate consultation with xenopsychology specialists regarding optimal deployment of human personnel in extreme scenarios. End message. As he transmitted the report, he reflected on the young human's final words. The hunt that refused to end, not as a past trauma, but as an ongoing commitment to protection through controlled violence. He wasn't sure whether that made him feel safer or more concerned about humanity's role in the galaxy's future. But he was certain that the other species in the Academy would never look at human cadets the same way again. And perhaps, he thought, as he dimmed his form to conserve energy, that was exactly what Cadet Kowalski had intended all along. The next morning brought an unusual sight to the Academy's central courtyard. Word of the previous day's revelation had spread through the cadet population with the speed that only institutional gossip could achieve, but the story had evolved in the telling. By breakfast, half the Academy believed that Amanda had single-handedly eliminated an entire planet's worth of apex predators, while the other half was convinced she was some kind of experimental super soldier created by human military intelligence. Neither version was particularly accurate, but both served her purposes. She found herself at the center of a carefully maintained bubble of respectful distance as she moved through the morning routine. The Corvan cadets offered her the warrior's greeting reserved for proven battle leaders, while the Skahari delegation had begun incorporating harmonic undertones into their standard communications whenever she was within hearing range. Even the usually dismissive Velkorian academic track students were treating her with something approaching deference. The transformation in social dynamics was exactly what she'd hoped for, but it came with complications she hadn't fully anticipated. Kowalski. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Thrace, the Academy's senior human instructor and the closest thing to a mentor that human cadets had access to. His weathered face bore the scars of 3 decades in the Colonial Marine Corps, and his expression suggested this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Sir?" She came to attention automatically, her prosthetic leg locking into position with a soft mechanical hiss. "My office. Now." He turned and walked away without waiting for acknowledgement, his bearing suggesting barely controlled irritation. Amanda followed him through the Academy's labyrinthine corridors, noting the way other cadets stepped aside to let them pass. Word had definitely spread, and she was beginning to understand that her calculated revelation might have consequences beyond improved standing with her alien classmates. Thrace's office was spartanly decorated, containing only the essential furniture and a few mementos from his active service years. He gestured for her to sit, then remained standing behind his desk, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. 18 months, he said without preamble. 18 months of solo hunting, tracking down and eliminating 43 apex predators on a hostile world, and somehow this never came up during your entrance interviews or psychological evaluations. Sir, I disclosed the basic facts about the Kepler 442b incident. The details were classified by Colonial Security pending completion of their investigation. The details. His laugh held no humor. The details include the fact that you voluntarily underwent what amounts to advanced combat conditioning in the field, developed tracking and elimination protocols that impressed military specialists, and emerged from the experience with psychological adaptations that our standard evaluation metrics couldn't even detect. He moved to the window overlooking the Academy's training grounds, where early morning exercises were underway. Do you have any idea what kind of position this puts the human program in? Amanda remained at attention, but her expression showed genuine confusion. I'm not sure I understand the problem, sir. The problem, Thrace turned back to face her, is that every other species at this academy now believes that humans routinely produce teenage super soldiers who can eliminate apex predators for sport. They're expecting that level of performance from every human cadet who walks through these doors. The implications hit her immediately, and she felt a familiar knot of guilt forming in her stomach. Sir, I never claimed that my experience was typical of human capabilities. I specifically explained the circumstances that led to. You think they were listening to context? He sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 53 years. Kowalski, alien psychology doesn't work like human psychology. When a Corvin hears about a human accomplishing something, they assume it represents the baseline capability of the entire species. When a Eskahari witnesses an individual demonstration, they interpret it as evidence of collective racial characteristics. She sank into the offered chair, her prosthetic leg adjusting automatically to maintain balance. I was trying to establish credibility for human persistence behaviors, not create unrealistic expectations. You were trying to solve an immediate social problem without considering the long-term institutional implications. Thrace's expression softened slightly, which, ironically, is exactly the kind of narrow-focused thinking that got you into trouble on Kepler 442b in the first place. The comparison stung because it was accurate. During the siege, she'd focused intensely on immediate threats while losing sight of broader strategic considerations. The hunt that followed had been similarly narrow in scope: eliminate the pack, regardless of psychological or social consequences. What do you recommend, sir? Honestly, I'm not sure there's a way to put this particular genie back in the bottle. He activated his desktop display, showing what appeared to be a series of communication logs and scheduling requests. In the last 12 hours, I've received inquiries from 7 different species military attachés requesting consultations about human combat potential. The Corvin delegation wants to establish a joint training program based on what they're calling human persistence protocols. The Zephyrian Academic Council is proposing a complete revision of their interspecies psychology curriculum. The display shifted to show personnel files for every human cadet currently enrolled at the Academy. More immediately, your classmates are being evaluated against the performance standards you established yesterday. Fair or not, every human cadet is now expected to demonstrate the kind of capabilities you showed in that combat simulation. Amanda studied the files, noting performance metrics and psychological evaluations that suddenly seemed inadequate compared to her own unconventional background. How many of them are going to fail because they can't match expectations that never should have been set in the first place? Unknown, but probably enough to damage the human program's credibility for the next several years. Thrace leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Unless we find a way to reframe the narrative. Sir, you demonstrated that humans can achieve exceptional results under extreme circumstances. The question now is whether we can teach other species to recognize the difference between exceptional circumstances and normal operating parameters. He stood and moved to a wall display showing the Academy's organizational structure, with human cadets distributed throughout various programs and specializations. The alternative is to lean into the narrative you've created and see if we can help other human cadets live up to the new expectations. Amanda felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the same feeling she'd experienced when she realized that the hunt was her task and hers alone. What would that involve? Advanced training protocols, accelerated programs designed to push human cadets toward their maximum potential instead of allowing them to coast on minimum acceptable standards. His expression was serious, but not unkind. It would be voluntary, but the pressure to participate would be significant. She considered the implications, weighing the potential benefits against the risks of pushing other cadets beyond their natural limits. And if some of them can't handle that level of training? Then they wash out, and we explain to the alien delegations that human capabilities exist on a spectrum like any other species. Thrace returned to his desk and sat down, his hands folded in front of him. The difference is that now they'll expect the upper end of that spectrum to be considerably higher than they previously assumed. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chiming sound from the office's communication system. Thrace accepted the incoming message, and the wall display shifted to show the face of Admiral Chen, the Academy's commandant. Lieutenant Commander, I need to see you and Cadet Kowalski in my office immediately. We have a situation developing that requires immediate attention. The transmission ended before either of them could respond, leaving them looking at each other with expressions of mutual concern. Sir, Amanda said quietly, I have a feeling this isn't about academic performance standards anymore. Thrace stood and moved toward the door, his bearing shifting back to the crisp military precision that marked him as a veteran of actual combat operations. No, it's not. When the commandant uses the word situation in that tone of voice, it usually means someone's shooting at something they shouldn't be. They moved through the Academy's corridors at a pace just short of running, other cadets stepping aside automatically as they passed. The usual morning bustle seemed muted, and Amanda noticed that several alien species were displaying stress indicators, chromatic shifts, pheromone releases, involuntary harmonic emissions. Admiral Chen's office occupied the top floor of the Academy's central tower, with panoramic windows offering views of the surrounding star system. Normally, those windows showed peaceful space traffic and the distant gleam of other inhabited worlds. Today, they were filled with the angular shapes of military vessels arranged in what was clearly a defensive formation. The commandant himself was a compact man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of steady demeanor that came from decades of making life-or-death decisions under pressure. When they entered his office, he was standing at the main display wall, studying tactical readouts that made Amanda's stomach clench with recognition. Ah, Kowalski. Excellent timing. He turned to face them, his expression grim, but not panicked. Tell me, Cadet, how much do you know about Ravager pack expansion patterns? The question hit her like a physical blow, and she felt her prosthetic leg stabilization systems engage automatically as her biological reflexes tried to prepare for flight or fight. Sir, I'm not sure I understand. Yesterday's performance generated considerable interest among our intelligence services. Specifically, your analysis of pack behavior patterns and individual hunting techniques. He gestured toward the tactical display, which now showed a three-dimensional map of nearby star systems. It seems that your experience on Kepler 442b was not as isolated as we initially believed. Red indicators appeared on the map, marking locations throughout the local galactic region. Too many red indicators spread across too many systems to represent random attacks or isolated incidents. Coordinated expansion, Amanda whispered, the implications hitting her with sick certainty. They're not random packs. They're organized. Exactly. What we thought were isolated incidents involving small packs of Ravagers are actually part of a larger migration pattern. Systematic expansion into human colonial space, with each successful hunt providing intelligence and resources for the next wave of attacks. Thrace had moved to study the tactical display more closely, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "Sir, how long has this been going on?" Our analysts believe the pattern started approximately 6 months before the Kepler 442b incident, which means Cadet Kowalski's pack wasn't just random raiders, they were advanced scouts for a much larger operation. The revelation recontextualized everything about Amanda's experience in ways that made her feel physically ill. The ghost hadn't been leading a simple hunting pack, it had been conducting reconnaissance for an invasion force. The ghost was gathering intelligence, she said, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. That's why they maintained the psychological pressure for so long instead of just overwhelming the settlement. They were learning about human response patterns, defensive capabilities, weaknesses they could exploit. And now we have evidence that similar intelligence-gathering operations have been conducted on 17 other human colonies over the past 2 years. Admiral Chen activated another section of the display, showing detailed reports from various colonial authorities. The good news is that most of these colonies survived their encounters, largely due to the defense protocols you and your settlement developed. The bad news, Thrace said grimly, is that the Ravagers have been learning from each encounter. Their tactics are evolving, becoming more sophisticated and more specifically tailored to exploit human psychological and tactical patterns. Amanda stared at the display, her mind racing through implications and connections that she didn't want to acknowledge. "Sir, how much information did they gather before I eliminated the pack?" "Unknown. But given the intelligence we're seeing in their subsequent operations, we have to assume they learned enough to pose a significant threat to human colonial security." The Commandant moved to his desk and activated a secure communication link. "Which is where you come in." "Me, sir? You're the only human who has successfully eliminated an entire Ravager pack. More importantly, you're the only one who has demonstrated the ability to outthink them strategically over an extended period." His expression was serious, but somehow hopeful. "We need you to help us understand what we're facing and develop countermeasures before their expansion reaches critical mass." The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden, but this time it felt different, heavier, with implications that extended far beyond personal survival or even the safety of a single settlement. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "We're asking you to become a military consultant while completing your academy training. Specifically, we want you to work with our intelligence analysts to develop profiles of Ravager expansion patterns and recommend defensive strategies for threatened colonies." Thrace was studying the tactical displays with obvious concern. "Sir, with respect, asking a 19-year-old cadet to take on that level of responsibility is exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that might save human lives," the Commandant interrupted. "Cadet Kowalski has already demonstrated capabilities that our professional analysts missed. She identified behavioral patterns that military specialists overlooked, and she developed countermeasures that proved effective under field conditions." He turned back to Amanda, his expression both questioning and expectant. "The question is whether you're willing to take on this responsibility. It would mean accelerated advancement through the Academy program, immediate access to classified intelligence, and direct involvement in military planning operations." She looked at the tactical display, watching the red indicators that marked Ravager activity across human space. Each one represented a colony that might face the same terror her settlement had experienced, with families that might lose members the way she'd lost Jake, the hunt that refused to end. she said quietly, understanding finally clicking into place. Exactly. Are you prepared to continue that hunt on a galactic scale? Amanda stood at attention, her prosthetic leg locking into position with a soft mechanical sound that somehow seemed louder in the commandant's office than it had anywhere else. Sir, with respect, I never stopped hunting. I've just been waiting for someone to show me where the pack went. Admiral Chen's expression shifted to something that might have been relief mixed with grim satisfaction. Excellent. Your first briefing begins in 2 hours. Lieutenant Commander Thrace will coordinate your new training schedule to accommodate your consulting responsibilities. As they prepared to leave the office, the Commandant called after them. One more thing, Cadet. Your demonstration yesterday was more than just an impressive show of individual capability. It was proof that humans can adapt to threats that other species might consider impossible to overcome. He gestured toward the tactical display, where the red indicators continued to pulse ominously. Now we need to find out whether that adaptability can be scaled up to protect entire colonies instead of just individual settlements. Yes, sir. Though I should mention that the original hunt taught me something important about scaling up operations. Which is? Amanda's expression grew thoughtful, her eyes focusing on the tactical display with the same intensity she'd once used to track Ravager sign through alien forests. Sometimes the most effective way to protect a large area is to make the enemy come to you instead of trying to chase them across vast distances. The Commandant was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of her statement. You're suggesting we use human colonies as bait. I'm suggesting we use human persistence as a strategic asset. Let the Ravagers continue their expansion into human space, but make sure they encounter defenders who are prepared for their tactics and capable of turning their own hunting instincts against them. That's a high-risk strategy, Cadet. So was walking into a box canyon to face down an apex predator with nothing but improvised weapons and 18 months of accumulated anger. Her smile was sharp and predatory, echoing the expression that had unnerved her alien classmates. But it worked then, and it can work now. As they left the Commandant's office, Thrace shook his head with something that might have been admiration. You know, Kowalski, most people would consider promotion to military consultant a privilege and an honor. I do consider it an honor, sir, but not a privilege. She gestured toward the windows, where the military fleet continued its defensive formation. It's just the next phase of the same hunt I've been on since I was 17 years old. And if this hunt never ends either? Amanda's expression grew distant, her eyes reflecting something that made her look older than her 19 years. Then I guess I'll keep hunting until there's nothing left to hunt. That's what humans do when something threatens the pack we've chosen to protect. They walked in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what had just occurred. Finally, Thrace spoke up with obvious concern in his voice. You realize that accepting this role will fundamentally change your relationship with the other cadets, don't you? You'll no longer be just another student trying to prove herself. You'll be the human who's advising military command on matters of life and death for entire colonies. I know. Her prosthetic leg whirred softly as they navigated a particularly steep section of corridor. But yesterday taught me something important about social dynamics and leadership responsibility, which is, sometimes the most important thing you can do for your pack is to make them understand that their individual limitations aren't as significant as they think, that human capabilities extend beyond what most of us ever have to discover about ourselves. They'd reached the intersection where their paths diverged, Thrace toward his administrative responsibilities, Amanda toward her accelerated training schedule. Before parting, he turned to face her with an expression of serious concern. One final question, Cadet. Are you prepared for the possibility that this expanded hunt might require you to make decisions that result in other people's deaths? That protecting the larger population might mean sacrificing smaller groups who could otherwise be saved? Amanda was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions that seemed too complex for someone her age. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of experience that no academy training could simulate. "Sir, I buried my brother in alien soil because I wasn't strong enough to protect him when it mattered. I spent 18 months learning to think like an apex predator because that was the only way to ensure no other family would lose someone the way we lost Jake." She touched the scars on her jawline, the ritual gesture that had become her way of acknowledging the cost of her choices. If accepting responsibility for larger-scale decisions means fewer people have to bury their brothers, then yes, I'm prepared for that burden. Thrace nodded slowly, his expression showing both approval and sorrow for the loss of innocence that such responsibility represented. "Then good hunting, Cadet. Try not to lose yourself in the process." As he walked away, Amanda remained at the intersection for several minutes, watching the flow of cadets from various species moving through their daily routines. Tomorrow, many of them would look at her differently, not as a fellow student, but as someone who had assumed responsibilities that extended beyond the academy's walls. The hunt that refused to end was expanding again, growing beyond personal survival, beyond settling scores with apex predators, beyond even protecting individual settlements. Now it encompassed the defense of human space itself, with implications that stretched across the galaxy. She touched her prosthetic leg, feeling the familiar vibration of its systems as they maintained her balance and mobility. The Ravagers had taken her original leg, but in return, they'd given her something far more valuable: the understanding that human limitations were often just the starting point for human adaptations. Now it was time to find out whether that principle could be applied to protecting an entire species instead of just one determined individual. The hunt continued, but the prey had changed once again.